As Fraser Alexander comes to the end of its 2012 centennial celebrations, one of the highlights amongst the many activities and events has been the publication of a record of its first 100 years, a high-quality coffee table book authored by Anthony Hocking. With me in the studio is Fraser Alexander CEO Jaap Nel and the author of the first 100 years, Anthony Hocking. Hi Jaap, and welcome Anthony. Jaap, can you give us some of the highlights of this centennial year?
For me, which was absolutely the highlight, was the publication of the coffee table book.
Yes.
And the coffee table book is Fraser Alexander, the first 100 years, very nicely packaged. And the credit must go to Anthony, which carefully researched this book and authored this book. This version captures the abbreviated version of the first 100 years, and we try to capture the essence.
Well, Anthony, can you give us some insights into this book? I see many of these faces here, very interesting faces, you know, going through to members of the Daly family and Peter Gain and Peter Flack and Johan Rupert, and now, of course, the Bafokeng community.
Many of the people in the mining industry are larger than life, and Fraser Alexander had more than its share.
And people today talk about transformation, and yup, there's transformation here. Indigenous South Africans in the form of the Bafokeng community are now the full owners of this company.
If we look at the history, starting with Fred and Fraser, into the era where we are actually now, is that there's those key moments in the last decade, I think, that's shaping definitely the next 100 years and beyond in terms of Fraser Alexander.
We're talking about a company that now employs 6,500 people in 14 countries and on more than 200 sites. So it has really been a company that's developed well.
I think Lambert van der Nest, my predecessor in terms of CEO, he did an outstanding job in terms of where Fraser was a very specialist focused to actually take it to the next level of collaboration, and from a speciality hopefully setting the scene and the foundation of taking us into more collaborative solutions going forward. Apart from that, building on that was the Bafokeng that came into the picture, as you mentioned. Bafokeng bringing that visionary aspect to Fraser Alexander, not only within South Africa, but definitely into Pan-Africa very strongly. And specifically, Jose Leroy Motolegi, absolute visionary leader, working on aspects like community beyond life of mine, which we're extremely passionate about. So it starts setting that scene for sustainability beyond the life of mine.
Dealing with that second 50 years, I was off to a flying start when I met up with the former deputy chairman, Gary Ray. He turned out to have total recall of everything that happened in his time, and a great way of telling stories. Thanks to Gary, I met up with all his cronies, and very fascinating they were. But then, of course, I still had the problem of the first 50 years. But I did find, in and among the things stored away at Fraser Alexander, a minutes book, the earliest written record from 1947. And in those times, of course, company secretaries didn't merely record decisions. They recorded the whole thrust of debate. And it was very plain to me from the events of 1947 and the following years that there had been mayhem in the company as the Dalys tried to stage a palace revolution to take everything over from the Alexanders. But still, it was only a tiny part of the story, I realized. How was I to find the Alexanders? That was the key thing. And so I resorted to the oldest trick in the book, in fact, the phone book. And I compared initials in the 1947 minutes book with initials in the Joburg telephone directory and struck gold. I found Moira Alexander, widow of one of Fraser Alexander's grandsons, who himself had worked for the company. She immediately put me on to her son Paul, who's a graduate historian and had made something of a hobby of looking into Alexander antecedents. It was a eureka moment. When I went to Paul in Cape Town, I found he had masses of information about the family, about Fraser Alexander himself, beyond just the photograph, which is all the company had had, and fascinating he turned out to be. The company had a vague idea that he'd been the dumpsman at Crown Mines, a fairly lowly position. It turned out that far from being that, he'd been Chief Production Officer at Crown Mines, the first. As such, the second in command on the mine, and the most senior such man in the industry and indeed the world. A very much bigger man than anyone had guessed. But better than that, I found that as a youngster, the 21-year-old Fraser had been in on the discovery of the Rand. He'd been working at the Jan Baantjes camp at Roodepoort, and he personally shoveled the first 20 tons that went through the Struben stamp mill at Roodepoort and proved that the Main Reef was viable. So in terms of credentials for a company, who could have done better? But another thing I discovered from Paul was that Fraser hadn't been alone in starting the company. He'd also had a cousin, Fred Alexander. Now, Paul didn't know anything about Fred. So there, I tried the Joburg Public Library, which has files on all the Rand pioneers. And in among them was Fred, another eureka moment. It turned out that, again, as a 21-year-old, that Fred had been one of the first rugby Springboks. He'd played in the first two tests that South Africa played against the British Isles, 1891. Wasn't really a Springbok, of course, because the term wasn't coined until 1906. But nevertheless, in terms of sporting greatness, he stood on a pedestal. And the rest of his life was regarded as a major hero. When eventually he died in 1937, the cortege for his funeral stretched 5 kilometers. Just showed you what kind of influence he had around Johannesburg.
We talk about entrepreneurship here, and that just seemed to come instinctively. They saw the opportunity with waste and the whole tailings dump area and mine dumps, which I think would have been the last thing on most entrepreneurs' mind, but they turned muck into money.
In his years before being Chief Reduction Officer, Fraser Alexander had personally pioneered the idea of slime dams. He'd also been in on milling technology. Many of his ideas are still in use. He was one of the very first to realize the significance of the cyanide process, which, as you will know, saved the whole industry in 1889.
And you know, people talk about sustainability so glibly. I'm sure it never crossed his lips, but brother, he built something that was sustainable.
I think he'd be astonished.
What does the future look like, Jaap, for Fraser Alexander?
If you look at the current Exco team, management team, senior leaders team, we've really have an arsenal of exceptional leaders that understands the complexity of the market we play in, the complexity of the international market we play in. And I think those combination of aspects sets the scene and the foundation of taking us into the next century and beyond.
It's been an interesting few minutes chatting about the history of Fraser Alexander, so well recorded in this wonderfully presented book, Fraser Alexander, The First 100 Years.